the voice. Okay. Let me move the chat out of the way. Hello to everybody and welcome once again, 75th straight episode of History Matters and So Does Coffee. Today, as advertised, once again on Thursday, and this time with Matt's encouragement, Matt came up with the idea, and it's a fine idea. We're going to be talking about history and memory, inspired by the fact that we're coming up on the weekend of 9/11. So we're going to put that in context, talk about that a little bit more broadly, about what we remember from history and what we don't remember, what we choose to remember, what we don't choose to remember, or what others don't want us to remember in one way or another. But before I plunge into that topic, it is time for my partner in crime, Matt, to explain the rules of the game.
And good morning, everybody. Welcome. And we're really glad to have you. This can't believe it's 76. 70, is that what it is?
75.
75. Wow. Incredible. Rules of the game are as follows. We encourage you to please use the chat to have conversations that are about what we're talking about, tangent to what we're talking about. Just please make sure they're family friendly and germane to the conversation, and always family friendly. So we do encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. That's where I like to take questions. It's a lot easier to keep track of folks if you do it from the Q&A. And as always, if you like what we do here at the National Council for History Education, please join us at www.ncheteach.org. And you can click on join and get lots of wonderful benefits, including History Matters, which is on the topic, which is why I picked this topic, because it was on my mind because I was working on History Matters last week. Our monthly news
publication.
Yes, our monthly newsletter. We have a great blog. A colleague of mine wrote a wonderful blog on history and memory, and for this month. And I also want to say that we are going to be announcing our fall lineup of webinars and 21-22 colloquia in the next week or so. And we have some incredible,
NCHE.
Oh my gosh, we have some great stuff coming up. I'm so excited I can't even stand myself. So with that, I will turn it back over to Joanne, and we will have a great conversation this morning.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Matt. And I don't know if folks can hear, but Newbie, he's in prime form. Okay, so as promised, I want to talk about here. There we go. I want to talk about history, what we remember, what we don't remember, what we choose to remember, what people sometimes don't want us to remember. And indeed, it was prompted by the fact that we're coming up on the anniversary of September 11th, the 10-year anniversary, which is kind of shocking. And, I was surprised tweeting about it. I actually didn't say very much about it, but what I sort of sent out into the social media sphere when thinking about it was that I haven't been to the museum or even the memorial yet. The memorial I'll probably get to. The museum, I'm not sure if I can, because I have, my feelings are too strong. I don't know. I don't know if I could handle going to that museum. I have a very hard time handling anything that has to do with 9/11 because of what I remember of my feelings at the time, which is part of what prompted my thoughts about the approach that we can take this morning, or at least how we can enter the topic this morning about history and memory. Because what I'm remembering from 9/11, of course, as a historian and an American, I'm remembering the facts of the day, the significance of the day, the tragedies, the many tragedies of that day. There are many things I remember, but what is sort of first and foremost in commemorating the day ends up being my feelings from that moment. And that's kind of inescapable. And that's sort of part of what I want to talk about is why and how we remember historical events personally, and then in a broader sense, why and how we remember things and what we remember. And as I said a moment ago, what sometimes people don't want us to remember. When I guess it was my American Revolution course. And I was doing this in reverse. I was trying to talk to students about what it would have felt like at the time during the revolution at certain key events, and that were shocking at the time. And I remember standing up in front of this big lecture hall and wanting to think of a shocking event to link with what I'm about to talk about here. And I didn't want to mention September 11th because it would take the lecture and the room to a totally different space and out of the revolution. But that was the only thing I could think of that sort of compared with this. And what I'm talking about is the news of Lexington and Concord. This is many years ago, and I couldn't re-find this morning in preparing my comments for this morning where I found this. But what I do remember is in the lecture I gave to my American Revolution course that day, I had found a handful of comments from people that essentially, and this is going to be a bad paraphrase, but essentially were some version of, I remember where I was when I heard the news of Lexington, or I was eating lunch, I was at my table eating when I heard the news of Lexington. It was 2 or 3 comments of the sort that we do all the time in modern times when you hear something shocking. I can say the same thing about 9/11. You remember precisely where you were because it's a shocking moment that something happens that you didn't imagine really necessarily could happen, and it changes the way you fundamentally understand in some way the world around you. So what I was trying to communicate to my class, and which I still find kind of profoundly moving in a way, was the fact that American colonists at the time, hearing the news that British soldiers had fired on British colonists at Lexington, was such a shock that people knew precisely where they were at the moment of hearing it. We lose that kind of immediacy, particularly when looking far back in time. And I know I must have said this a few thousand times, the of courses of the founding era, everything is a big of course, but of course, nothing is of course at that particular moment in time. And this is a great example of that. The shock of hearing what had just happened. British soldiers had fired on British subjects, colonists, but British subjects, the shock of that and people trying to process that. So that's kind of what is in the back of my mind as I'm going to be talking about what we're talking about this morning. These moments, ways in which we remember what we come to realize are historic moments. We might not necessarily always know that when they're happening, but in time, we sort of come to realize, in part because of their larger significance, in part because of how they shaped us and the way we understand things, that they were historic moments. And what does that do to the way we remember them? The first person who came to mind when I was thinking about this, which is not going to be surprising given that I was just talking about people hearing about the Battle of Lexington, was George Robert Twelves Hughes, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. Alfred Young, historian Alfred Young, wrote a very famous article about him. And I sent earlier this morning, Matt, a link, which I think will be accessible to everybody online, to the article, which then became a book called, I think, The Shoemaker and the Tea Party by Alfred Young, about the same topic. And what's wonderful about it, and the reason it ties into what we're talking about today, is this is a great name. The world is exploding outside of me here in New York, and I don't know why. George Robert Twelves Hughes, with that wonderful name, lived a very long time after the Revolution, long enough that in the 1830s, I believe, people were interviewing him for his memories about the Revolution. And because of those interviews, he sort of ended up standing out in history in a way that he might not have otherwise, because he was a shoemaker, right? And who fought in the Revolution and was present at key events like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. But there's no reason we would remember him if it hadn't been for the fact that people realized, hey, wait a minute, like, this guy was there and he's still alive and we can interview him. And what strikes me about what he remembers, and I won't go into detail about it here, but if you find either the article or you pick up the book or you have them at the hand, at hand right now, what you'll see is that Alfred Young does a really good job of talking about all of the intricacies and qualifications of basing history on memory, right? So he talks about all of the ways in which memory can mislead you, particularly in this case, someone much older thinking back to their youth and all of the ways in which being towards the end of your life shifts how you remember things that are more towards the beginning of your life. So it's not as though these kinds of memories, comments, tellings of historical moments are unproblematic in the way that we treat them, but they are invaluable in part even simply because of the things that get remembered and what they tell you about the impact that they might have had at the time. So in the case of Hughes, one of the things that, well, actually two of the things that he remembers, which I use when I teach because they're such a great example of the impact, I don't want to say psychological, the sort of broader impact of the message of the revolution. He remembers, and he talks to his interviewer about the fact that in the 1760s, he made a pair of shoes that ultimately was intended for John Hancock, so the John Hancock. And apparently Hancock very much liked the shoes and invited Hughes to do what many people would do. This was a tradition in the United States for many decades. On New Year's Day, you would pay a call on particularly people with power, and you were entitled to sort of show up and sort of make an appearance and exchange New Year's greetings. People that did that, the presidency, the White House in the beginning of the 19th century had enormous, huge lines of people who wanted to go and enforce their right to go to the president and say Happy New Year to the president. So in this case, Hancock invites Hughes to come to his house and they can exchange New Year's wishes on New Year's. Now, Hughes, what he remembers when he's being interviewed about this is being terrified, being just terrified because Hancock was like this elite, powerful figure, terrified because he didn't know what was going to happen once he was invited there and what he was going to be expected to do. The way that he remembers it is that he shows up at the house and is immediately shown into the kitchen, because that is where his sort belong, until the message is conveyed to Hancock that he's here. And Hancock says, no, bring him into the sitting room. And apparently the servant who first showed him into the kitchen, Hughes remembers him coming back and being a lot more respectful when he shows him into Hancock's sitting room. And he remembers Hancock wanting to share a toast to the new year with him. And Hughes remembers not knowing quite how to do that because he hadn't quite done it in that way with that kind of glass. And he stumbles through it and very happily leaves and never comes back. But his memory of that is, awestruck at this high society, powerful individual acknowledging him and wanting to interact with him. And a memory that he has, which is not all that long after. So this is the 1760s. What he then remembers in the 1770s is he wanted to enlist on board a ship to go fight during the revolution. The ship he wants to enlist on, apparently the lieutenant on that ship, he really didn't like. The lieutenant had an attitude. And Hughes' memory is that this lieutenant asked him on the street for Hughes to take off his hat with respect to one of his superiors, this lieutenant. And Hughes refused to take off his hat and said something along the lines of, I take off my hat to no man, and enlists on a different ship because he doesn't like this lieutenant. And Young makes the point that, you can't make an enormous big deal about that transition. However, what you do see is extreme deference and then this sort of sense of my rights as an individual, and you can't make me give you deference that I don't think you deserve. When you plug that into the larger narrative of what Hughes remembers about being on the street and seeing the Boston Massacre happening and feeling outraged, about his rage at just the British soldiers sort of milling about, and apparently one of them stiffed him for a pair of shoes. He made a pair of shoes and the soldier didn't pay him. That didn't help either. He took part in the Boston Tea Party. So what you can see is the impact of the events of what comes to be known as the revolution having on Hughes as he's experiencing them, which is kind of a great example of memory unfolding, showing history as it unfolded before Hughes knew it was history. So it's just Hughes in particular is a great example of memory and history, and the fact that some of the things that he really distinctly, seemingly remembers with great detail are things that were emotional for him. Right? Being scared of Hancock and being outraged at the soldiers and being angry at the lieutenant. He remembers these moments where he was made to make some kind of a choice in the moment, and it shaped or was born of something he was thinking in that moment about himself or who he was or where he belonged or what his rights were. So that was part of what led me to him, was, again, from 9/11, this feeling that sometimes what you remember are the things that touch you in a profound way. And you don't always necessarily realize that that's the dynamic that's happening until later in time. So, you know, if you ask me, I suppose I could say that 9/11, I was distraught. But I remember that in a gut way now, whenever I think about 9/11. I can't resist adding too, just because I love this fact. George Robert Twelves Hughes, and it's not entirely clear where the 12 comes from. Young ultimately thinks it's the maiden name of someone on his mother's side of the family, but he named one of his sons 11. I just love that fact. And even Young, in the article, if you go to see it, you'll see that Young is like, why? Like, maybe he had a mischievous sense of humor. Unclear why, but I just love that fact. You can be sure that I use that in my American Revolution course, because it's just this little human weirdness, again, of something that's history in all capital letters, but it isn't. It's about humanity. Now, another topic, a different kind of topic, but that raises profound issues about memory and history, and that has to do with how we do or don't remember slavery. Now, there is a book that's just come out in a new edition, which I didn't remember until researching this morning, and it's actually called Remembering Slavery, edited by Ira Berlin, Mark Favreau, and Stephen Miller. And it's largely a collection of interviews made with former enslaved people through the Federal Writers Project. So it is actually interviews with people who are remembering being enslaved, which is remarkable in and of itself. Again, that idea is tinged with some of the same cautions that Young uses regarding Hughes and what Hughes is remembering, that you remember things, you color them in different ways. And in both cases, you know, who these people are remembering these events to, who's interviewing them, is going to have an impact on how or what you either are remembering or are allowing yourself to remember or are willing to say, and how you're willing to say it. So there are all kinds of ways in which, as with any kind of primary evidence, as historians, we need to think about the actual piece of evidence that we're using, and in this case, these interviews, and what the on the ground situation is as to who's doing the interviewing, where is it, when is it, how old is the person, what are they remembering, what's the relationship between these people. There's all kinds of things you need to know before you can really process the information on the one hand. On the other hand, obviously, you can tell all kinds of invaluable things, and you can gain insights that are difficult to glean otherwise by having and reading these kinds of interviews, personal interviews with people. It's the sort of thing, when I do some of my own research, very often, if I can find a trial that has records, or an investigation of some kind that has records, I love that sort of thing as evidence, not because of all of the official formal evidence being presented, but because of the comments that people make between the lines, right? There'll be, you know, the throwaway lines or throwaway comments or things that clearly people are throwing into a conversation as a scene setter. But as a historian, you know, you see that and you realize, like, wait a minute. So, you know, in the case of my last book, there was a big investigation of one incident of congressional violence. And I remember reading the formal congressional report of the investigation. It's huge. But there was a point in it in which one of the people testifying says something like, and at that moment, as the fight broke out, everyone began jumping up on the tables and seats so that they could see what was happening, you know, like always happens. And I remember it was the, you know, like always happens. It was that throwaway line. It was like, wait, like whenever people, first of all, there's that much violence in Congress that it's being discussed that way, number one. Number two, people always jump up on desks so that they can see what's happening. Throwaway the person who said it probably had no memory of saying it 2 seconds after he said it. However, that's the sort of thing sometimes that gives you a real insight, a ground level human insight into moments in history of a sort that you might not be able to get otherwise. Now, in the case of slavery and in the case of race in America, obviously, not only do we have the questions of what we need to remember, what we can begin remembering in a more pointed way, what we can put into the historical record in a more aggressive way, what we can restore to public dialogue in a new and more aggressive, obvious kind of a way, but related to everything that I'm saying there. We have people who are very interested in not having certain things remembered, not having certain things discussed, not having certain things be included as a relevant and significant part of American history. Many of those moments have something to do with race in the United States or slavery in the United States, indigenous people. Just in recent years, we've had all kinds of moments in which significant moments of violence against Black Americans have been brought out and discussed in one way or another in a more assertive way, a more detailed way, and with a sense that this thing, this event should be better known and hasn't been because no one really wanted to talk about it. When you get to questions of race and slavery, you're dealing with aggressive resistance to certain kinds of memories. And that can feel, depending on who you are and how you're saying it, that very much can feel like and ultimately be acted out like a battle for asserting a place in history. And we see that happening all the time now. I see I'm almost on the edge of running out of time. We see that, in the variety of different culture wars that we're in the middle of right now. One of them has to do with this very question about what gets remembered in American history, what counts as American history, what is seen as normal in American history, and whether American history should be remembered as a big commemoration of golden shiny things, or whether we really, and obviously as a historian, my assumption here, my view is very clear, whether we really need to wrestle with the reality of history, which can be ugly, which is has all kinds of failings in it, which isn't to say that all we should look at are the failings, but if you don't include the ugliness and the failings and the all of the ways in which Americans and the United States didn't live up to what it could be, you're not telling the story of America. That's part of our story. And I've said this, I know, in a variety of different ways and times on History Matters. There is absolutely no way that you can understand the current moment if you don't acknowledge all of that history from the past, the ugliness and the conflict and the ways in which people have been asserting themselves and repressing other people, the things that have happened that are uncomfortable to remember, like, in my case, 9/11 for a totally different reason, but still, history, remembering history, talking about history can and sometimes should make us feel uncomfortable. I don't want to go into great detail about the 1619 Project and the sort of people arguing against it. I know that in the recent week or two, there was another debate about that in which Gordon Wood and a handful of other historians came out with a statement again about how the revolution was not about defending and protecting slavery, and Woody Holton, who's coming out with a new book. Actually, Wood and Holton are both coming out with books on the revolution. So that's part of what prompted this exchange. But just in the last week or two, that's been unfolding about, what should we be remembering and what's the role of slavery in the way we remember the founding and the revolution, which is a pretty big, significant question. That's, thinking this morning about what I was going to say, one of the things I was thinking of, because what I wrote down is 1619, 1776. And what I realized is, and in part it has to do with the naming of the 1619 Project, that debate sometimes becomes so focused on the beginning, the telling of the story. Like, when does it begin? Does the nation begin in 1619 or 1776? When you think of it that way, isn't that really not the important question here? I mean, the important question isn't necessarily like, what year do we count America beginning in? Isn't the larger question, how did we begin? And how did that progress? That we tend to get wrapped up in nationhood and years. And that's logical. You know, there's a reason why many people mistakenly assume that studying history is just memorizing a bunch of years. We all know that is not true. But the question there really is a bigger question, obviously, 1619, 1776, about what we remember and how we remember it, and what importance or relative significance we give to different aspects of the American narratives, because there isn't one. So all of that is a long way of getting around to the point that, and again, we all know this, there is not one single straight line historical narrative. There are narratives that depend very much on who's doing the remembering, who's doing the interviewing, who's doing the writing, who seemingly controls that narrative, but that the complexity of that and the fact that you need to consider who is writing the narrative, who is it for, what is it aimed to do, that you have to consider all of these things when looking at the telling of history, that's pretty vitally important. And I think it's one of the really important reasons why getting people past the idea that history is a series of facts is important. Not that there aren't facts, there are facts in history, but the understanding of history isn't about memorizing facts. It's about understanding a broader unfolding of events and what it means. And among the very important aspects of what it means is what it means on a human level, what it means on the level of people making choices and how that shaped outcomes. That we can't always look at history as a series of events happening up here that are, as I said before, shiny and beautiful and polished, and then came democracy, and then came freedom, and then came. The narrative, the way we frame the telling of history matters a lot. And our thoughtfulness about that framing matters a lot as well. So those are all issues that I wanted to raise today and open things up to discussion. The last thing, actually, I don't want to leave without mentioning it, only because it's such a prime example. And I glossed right over it here, and I don't want to forget it on my notes, never mind in reality. The other thing that occurred to me this morning that has to do with what we're allowed to remember, or what people want to not have us remember about history, has to do with the death of Emmett Till in 1955, the 14-year-old Emmett Till. That there's a memorial to him in Mississippi put up at the spot where supposedly his body was pulled from the water after he was kidnapped and tortured and lynched. And that memorial keeps being shot, pulled down, attacked. And I wanted to mention that only because it can't be blunter. An example of people literally trying to erase a moment from being remembered. Of course, ironically, in doing that, they're ensuring that we will aggressively and assertively remember it. But that's acting out in real life, an attempt to erase ugliness from the past, which can't be erased. It has to be accepted and acknowledged as part of the building of what America is today. Okay, I'm a little over. I'm going to stop at this point. I'm going to bring my mug out. I remembered. Okay, so this is not going to be surprising at all. Oops, except I really don't want, problem is I always put, okay, there. This is not going to be surprising at all, but it was the obvious contender. History matters, folks. How could I not commemorate us? There can be no more appropriate mug than the mug that says history matters and how we remember and tell it matters. Okay, now Matt. Can't hear you, Matt.
I know.
Okay.
I started to talk and then I realized I was muted. So then I just started acting like I was talking.
Okay. I got to get more coffee in me.
I know, I tell you. All right. Yeah, so my background, somebody got it right away, which I'm getting weird shadows. I apologize for that. This is the Tower of Voices in Pennsylvania, commemorating at the site of the where Flight 93 went down. And so I love the concept behind this. It's one of those sort of thoughtful memorials. So I wanted to commemorate that today.
It's an excellent choice.
Okay, so we have 5 questions
Ooh, okay.
so far. So I encourage everybody to put in questions. And I won't make any idle threats today, but
because they are truly idle.
You're right. They're real threats. No. But put in your questions, because we really do like hearing from you and letting you all sort of frame the conversation. So
and before we do that, let me say what I hinted at before, is that I sent Matt this morning a link to the Library of Congress page where you can actually get access to the interviews with formerly enslaved people, and a link to the George Robert Twells Hughes article.
Yep, and those are both up on our site. So so if you want to go to the History Matters site, and those are up and ready to go. So obviously the recording isn't yet, because we're still recording, but the links are up, and it's where it's supposed to be, and next week's link is up and all that.
I think we're all having a beginning of semester day.
Right?
I am having a beginning of semester day.
All right, well, let's start with Dale's question. What is your view? And I have no frame of reference for this other than saying, what is your view on the Joseph Plum Martin's memoir?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I guess that falls to me in the same category as some of the other things that I'm talking about. I for my revolution course, there's I think I mentioned this maybe last week, the Spirit of 76 book, edited by Henry Steele Commager and Richard B. Morris, which has all of these sort of memories and recountings, and most of them from the time period, but still about the revolution. I guess the Martin book, the Martin Recollections or Diary, I put in the same category, which is as long as you're using that kind of stuff and acknowledging the strengths and weaknesses of it, I think that's a good thing to do. And as I said before, you can glean a lot of things, even if you're not absolutely sure about what's being written down, how it's being written down, why it's being written down. Like I remember discovering when I was working on my first book, that William Maclay's diary about his time in the US Senate and the first Congress, even though it's a diary, he meant it to be seen by other people. So you have to actually think about the nature of the text that you're looking at. But I think any text from someone at that moment has value from a historical moment. You just have to be a good historian in analyzing what it is and thus what the shortcomings are. Oh, there I see someone, because you guys are always so great, has put the link up to the diary that we're talking
about. Dave is asking, this is probably a lengthier answer, so hopefully you're ready.
Okay.
Dave is asking, how can historians separate information, quote unquote, and disinformation, quote unquote? How do you separate information from disinformation as a historian?
As a historian, well, I mean, in I don't know if it's like, as a historian, like looking for history in the past, I'm assuming is what that's being, because in the present, we do what everybody else needs to do too, which is desperately dig around to try and figure out if whatever the heck is being claimed actually is true. For me, certainly in my most recent book, I had to think about that all the time. Mm-hmm. Because kind of along the lines of what I was talking about today, there are a lot of people who didn't particularly want certain things to be remembered. There's a reason why all the violence I talked about, for the most part, is not in the congressional record. Mm-hmm. Once that's the case, then you have to, when you're finding it, you have to ask precisely that question. Is this true? Is this actual information? Or is it, someone trying to smack at some politician or make Virginia look bad or whatever? You end up having to, I called it triangulate my findings. So, and I did that in a very deliberate, specific way in the case of that book. I did not allow myself to believe any incident of violence proven with only one form of evidence. So in other words, if I saw it in the congressional record, which was the least likely, but if I did and couldn't find confirmation anywhere else, I had to question it. That was particularly true, more true, if I found it in a newspaper or in a diary or in a letter. if I couldn't find any other way to confirm it, very often I wouldn't allow myself to keep it, even if I thought it was true. And I don't remember if I've told this story before, but there's one incident, as far as I can tell, the biggest moment of gunplay in Congress in the time that I looked for, when there was Joshua Giddings from Ohio, a really ardent abolitionist, giving a speech, and a fellow from Louisiana stood up and cocked his pistol and aimed it at him. And then 2 or 3 people stood alongside Giddings with their guns and pointed them at this other fellow. So then 2 or 3 people came and stood next to the fellow with their guns. So basically you have 6 or 8 people with guns as this abolitionist is saying his piece. An amazing incident, but I did not allow myself to use it in the book unless I could find more than the Joshua Giddings, who included it in a memoir account, right? He was like, I remember the day. It's like, well, for obvious reasons, I can't count that. He's going to want these slaveholders to look bad. And he's going to remember, me being brave. So until literally, I found that at some early point. It was years and years and years later, in the last month of my refining the manuscript, that I was like, Freeman, this is it, do or die. You either find the evidence of this somewhere besides him, or you can't put it in the book. Mm-hmm. And I literally, it ended up in there because I found a newspaper account, but still. So some pretty strict triangulation to prove to my satisfaction that it's real, and to prove in a way that I know others won't be able to question the fact that this actually happened.
It's got to be really hard. I'm just thinking back to our earlier conversations about newspapers and how they were used during the founding period as a mechanism for politics and, in some ways, political violence, right? Like, how was it easier or harder to separate information from disinformation during that time period?
In the 19th century newspapers?
Yeah.
Oh, it was much harder. And which is the irony, right? So normally I'm in the 1790s, or the very beginning of the 19th century, and there are far fewer newspapers, and the newspapers that are there are like 4 pages long. And so there's less information, right? And so you would think that when you move ahead into the 19th century and you get lots of newspapers, lots of pages, digitized, that you would be in a happy sea of information. But all that means is it's very hard to tell what's true, particularly with the rise of sensationalized newspaper coverage. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I could do all kinds of amazing searches and find things, but then I really had to try and figure out what was real in an extreme kind of a way, because honestly, there were some things that were just out and out, blunt, in your face lies in these newspapers. In the earlier period, the same was true, but somehow in the 19th century, there was like a little panache added in. Like they were like, you know what? We're putting this in. Let's see what you make of this. So it became harder. And there were incidents that I still don't know if they happened. And I think about that because I think, so I'm a historian centuries later with databases doing precisely what this question asked, trying to figure out what's true. And I don't know. If I was alive back then reading one newspaper, how would I be able to, you would tend to believe it or not, but you'd have no way to evaluate that really at the time. So it made me think a lot about what it was like to receive news at this different period in time, and the fact that with all of these other research aids at my disposal that I still no idea. And sometimes it's on purpose. Like, there was something in a newspaper, really sort of bad embarrassing congressional fight moment. And then in Congress, someone stood up and said, you all read that newspaper account about that moment, right? And everyone says, yeah. And this guy says, we all know it didn't happen, right? And everyone says, yeah. Now what? The newspaper says it did, and Congress says it didn't. I have no idea. Congress wouldn't want it to be true. It's not in my book. So this is the question, right? One of the big questions as a historian is being honest enough with yourself as a historian to not use things, even if they're wonderful, if you can't be absolutely sure that they're good evidence.
I saw I'm totally hijacking the conversation now. But there was an article, I think I've mentioned this in the past, but there was an article, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, yeah, but probably about a year ago, in Social Education about sort of the problems with digital databases, in that and these two authors from, I think they were from Florida, and I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but they kind of talked about some of the issues that we're having now with not having paper documents, right? And I think Tim asks a question which made me start to think along these lines. So I wonder if, can you comment a little bit about that? Do you see sort of the emergence of digital databases and sort of archives of Twitter feeds and that kind of stuff as problematic for future historians, or as something that's going to end up being helpful, or whatever?
Or both.
Or both. Or both.
Right. So on the one hand, it's helpful because it makes things more accessible to a wider population. It puts them in a form that potentially will survive longer than bad 19th century paper. The quality of the paper in the mid 19th century, like, it just disintegrates. Earlier paper is better, stronger. On the other hand, there are all kinds of ways in which these databases can make it difficult, or certainly can warp what you're finding. So for example, you use a database, and what you never do, or few of us do, is consider what isn't there and what is there, right? So you use a newspaper database, and there's hundreds of thousands of different issues of newspapers, which is great. But for all we know, if you don't look, they could be all from New England and a handful of Virginia ones thrown in. So without knowing the bias, kind of like archives, when you research in an archive, you don't know necessarily the silences and gaps in an archive. So you just assume the silences are silences, and they aren't necessarily. They could be constructed silences. And that's true in a database, that you can't tell what's not there if you're not thinking in that way. So that's a problem. And another problem is you will get what you ask for. So, I could sit down at a database and say, I want to look at dueling, and punch in dueling and get all of these references and write it down. I have a historian friend who calls books that are based on those kinds of searches database books, because they just ask for information, they get the information, they write it up with no sense of where the quotes come from, what are they using the wrong word, where's it on the page of a newspaper, like all of the things that give it meaning. All you know is that, well, there were 542 instances of this word, and thus it is important. If you say it that way, it's kind of hard to think about it that way. So databases, I couldn't have written the last book I did without databases. Right. Absolutely impossible. But that said, I'm sure it added years of my grappling with what I was seeing and how I was seeing it, and what I wasn't seeing and how I could figure it out. So, would I give up databases? No. I mean, my first book, if you look in the bibliographies of books back a certain amount of time, you will see people like me hopping from archive to archive to archive to archive and hunting for money so that I could get to the archive, so I could see the source materials. There was a lot less hopping involved with this book. However, that said, there's still all kinds of archives that have not digitized papers and collections, right? So I could do my project in a thorough way without necessarily going to quite as many archives. But what that means now too is it's extra effort that some people won't make. Yeah. See things that are less easily accessible. And very often, and I can attest firsthand, very often it's that less accessible stuff that nobody thinks of that has the bonanza. Yesterday on, I think it was on Twitter, someone said, archives need to have a special screaming room where you can go as a researcher when you find an amazing piece of evidence, and you can go into the screaming room and be like, scream room. I'm totally in favor of a screaming room where you could howl about some amazing piece of evidence you just found. But yeah, databases affect things in all kinds of good and bad ways, and I think people don't think about the bad ways necessarily. Well,
and I as you're talking there, I'm thinking, some of the things that you've done would never have happened without physically being there, finding the lock of hair, and and finding that was smushed between how many different pieces of pages that nobody ever knew was there, or right. Wasn't the account of the doctor at the Hamilton bird duel
on the bottom of a box?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was on the, I don't know now, for all I know, it is digitized. I don't know, but I found it on the bottom, in the bottom of a box. It's dated 1805. So I think people just, if they had managed to be lucky enough to get the box as opposed to microfilm, it just didn't seem significant. Wasn't easy to, it was actually almost impossible to read on microfilm. Yeah, there's all kinds of things that you find. And that's, you know, the serendipity aspect of researching, of stumbling across things you didn't know existed. You know, before the databases, when I was researching my first book, if I wanted to see like what Jefferson said about something, I would get the volumes of his papers and I would, you know, indexes don't necessarily do that kind of work. So I would page through, you know, volumes of their papers. And of course you find amazing things that you didn't know were there and would never have asked for when you're having to rummage around that way. With a database, you're essentially looking through a little slit at a huge box of stuff, and you can see like just a little bit, and you have no idea what else is floating around in there. So obviously I have very strong feelings about this because I love researching and I love finding the unexpected, but it's harder to do that in a database.
Yeah, I've heard that if you're having trouble reading something on like a really old document, like the Declaration of Independence, well, you just put lemon juice and a hairdryer on it, and it will secret writing just appears. It's really amazing.
And historians everywhere will howl, national treasure. No, no hair dryer and lemon juice on historical manuscripts. I literally, yeah, I howled out loud at that when I saw that for the first time. Someone Timothy just talked about sniffing sources. It's actually really true that sometimes you can smell things.
Oh, cool.
The most extreme example of that was, and I wish for the life of me, I can't remember whose papers they were, but they were at the Library of Congress. So often the Library of Congress, things will get delivered to the library in weird containers, like Clarence Darrow's papers were delivered in his laundry bag or something. Anyway, there's all kinds of weird. So in this case, whatever this, I want to say Virginia antebellum Southerner, not a famous one particularly, but when the papers got delivered, they were, along with them was this leather, what must have been a saddlebag, along with his papers. But what that meant was when I got the papers delivered to me, what I smelled was leather and tobacco. And it was just like, you know, and we're talking, it was probably from the 1830s, maybe. It was just unmistakable odor. And it was just like, well, there's the past kind of smacking me in the face, you know, leather and tobacco. It was a weird kind of sensory research experience that I'm sure I must have had it at some other point, but I don't remember. And that one was pretty striking.
So I'm gonna, Beth put something in chat, which I happened to catch, and it's a really good sort of transition to maybe a good way to end this conversation, which is, as far as 9/11 goes, we're sort of in this moment, as I was watching everybody kind of talk about where they were and what, you know, some of the tragedies they remember and, you know, from their lives. Beth put it this way, that we're this transition moment between something being a memory and something becoming history.
Right.
And I wondered if you could comment a little bit more about that. And how do we, as lovers of history, navigate that shift?
No, it's, you know, it's on the one hand, as a historian, it feels a little naive to be like, you know, history is really happening, right? Because history is always happening. On the other hand, there are moments when there are events that are so significant that are unfolding that you know that they will have broad historical significance. And we're in the middle of one of those moments. You know, I mean, as a historian in this current moment, assuming, you know, that what's happening will have significance, but my word, contingency, we don't know what that significance will be. But I think about that all the time, right? That, you know, I've done all kinds of quirky things because I assume that in the end, in one way or another, this moment will create some changes that matter. So for example, I often haven't done it actually probably been a couple months since I've done it, but for a while I was pretty regularly saving copies of some of the most racist or anti-Semitic things that I saw on Twitter that were so amazingly offensive, anti-Jewish, anti-Black, anti-whatever. I had to save them because I needed to know that in the future people would see them. And even though I know people say if things are online, they're forever, I personally wanted to collect things and have them together so that there they would be. Like here, I collected all this stuff and I put it together so that the future can see exactly what ugliness was unfolding right now, or at least the ugliness that passed in front of Joanne Freeman while she was sitting at her computer. I think it's worth thinking about that and being aware of that fact, that because I think if you are readily acknowledging the fact that we live in historic times, you will think about what's happening and you will feel responsible for what's happening in a different kind of a way. And I think that's important, so it's, how do I want to put this? I'm hesitating before saying contingency because I say it so often. But as I've said before, if you actually recognize the fact that things are unfolding, we don't know how they'll fold in the end. That's an important way to realize that you can create change in a given moment. So that too, there are a lot of things that are important in how we're processing, excuse me, the present. I have a sore throat today and I'm really not happy about that after going back to school for 1 week. But at any rate, it's significant in how we're processing this moment, not just for how we'll remember it, but for what we will see as what we can and should be doing in the current moment. So in that sense, history and memory and the present are really bundled together in an interesting, powerful kind of a way. I'm trying to catch up on what folks are saying.
No, it's fine. I was debating whether to make this point, and I'm curious. I'm gonna ask it, but feel free to say this is not a direction I want to go. But a number of years ago, a colleague of mine, Christy Brugger, who's the chair of the National Council for History Education now, and I did a presentation at a social studies conference about memory in general and how it's positioned in history. And we used The Giver as sort of a mechanism for talking about the young adult novel The Giver. But we also started, as part of that, we talked about we have to go deep memory here because it's been a while since obviously I've done this, but we juxtaposed Night, Elie Wiesel's seminal piece on the Holocaust, with Man's Search for Meaning, and the very different representations of being a Holocaust survivor in those two texts. And I wondered if there's anything to that from a historical perspective about how the importance of juxtaposing traumatic events and getting at the human experience in a very diverse way. Could you say a little bit about how do we elaborate on the human experience in a diverse way when it comes to traumatic experiences? The Holocaust, being the example.
Obviously, it's really important. And there are any number of ways in which it's vitally important, but there are any number of ways in which that can be difficult. It gets back to something I mentioned a moment ago, which is gaps in archives or silences in archives, right? Archives are put together by particular people with particular biases who believe that particular things are important and other things aren't, who preserve certain kinds of voices or have an easier time getting certain kinds of voices in that archive and just don't think about other voices. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily think along those lines, and so they don't realize that we have less diversity in the way that we're remembering things even through really good historical research, that there's some things that just aren't there, and you really deliberately have to be very creative in the way you're reconstructing those other viewpoints and those other voices. That's something that in recent times historians have been really giving a lot of thought to and producing really, really thoughtful creative work along those lines. But it's hard work to do. It's vitally important work to do for all of the reasons you mentioned and more. But it's even what I do is hard, and I'm talking about, for the most part, dead white guys who leave behind their papers. This is a whole different, much more difficult enterprise.
I'm going to squeeze in 2 more questions here because James, who rarely asks questions, asks one, so I'm going to get that one in.
Okay.
Idealized historical narratives and memory play a role in binding people together and sustaining peaceful coexistence. Can peaceful coexistence continue over time with dramatically diverging historical narratives, particularly when those narratives are widely disseminated, and aligned with actual events in history?
That's a really good question.
I thought so too.
It is. Well, I have part of an answer.
Okay.
The part of the answer that I'll offer is, obviously there is no one historical narrative, just as there's not one viewpoint, just as there are diverse ways of experiencing and remembering and understanding things. Democratic governance, in the same way, just as democratic society, is grounded on the fact that people can disagree and argue and debate, and that different viewpoints can exist at the same time. That's pretty fundamental. We're not having a very good time with that understanding right now in trying to eliminate certain things from being, that gets back to the shiny, polished version of American history. The fact of the matter is, we need to be able to have different things there at the same time that don't necessarily agree. And that should be a tool for us to reckon with. Like in my Revolution course, I include different accounts of the Boston Massacre, one from a British soldier, one from Samuel Adams. Boy, those are different events, the way that they're being recounted, but that doesn't mean you eliminate one as true and the other one is not true. So I think the how of what we're doing here matters a lot, and our awareness of what we're counting as history or not counting as history, and the fact that diversity of opinion and diversity of voices is part of the story, is central to the story, and that we have to remember that. That's hard to do for all of the reasons I've mentioned, but it's pretty essential.
Okay, so one last question. This is from Dave. In your imagination, what will historians 25 years from now stumble, quote unquote, across about today?
Ooh, like what will they not expect to find and will stumble across? Wow. In my imagination, that's
I love those kinds of sort of.
Yeah, let me think about that for a moment. I mean, my mind goes everywhere, and some of where it's going is really obvious. So obviously, at some point in the future, people will stumble across absolute evidence that the loudest anti-vax people are all vaccinated. Like that's not going to be a surprise. Right. But they'll be able to document that, or they'll stumble across the sorts of things that we're looking for all the time, which is things happening behind the scenes and agreements being made and things being hidden. I mean, these are the sorts of things that historians of any time period look for, which is like, how did they agree to, well, this gets back to our main theme, right? How did they agree of what things should be mentioned and what shouldn't? I'm always looking for these cases in which people are like, well, like when a Virginia congressman stands up and says, there were a lot of drunk people here last week. And then someone else stands up and says, you're not supposed to say that, right? It doesn't mean it's not true. Right. Now it's on the record, right? So there are always things like that you can find and that are vitally important. And there'll be a lot of them at this moment, despite all of the conspiracy thinking and the ways in which people are creating out of nothingness, conspiracies and weirdness happening. The fact of the matter is 25 years from now, people will be finding all kinds of interesting actual connections using actual historical evidence that will enable us to understand this moment in a way that even we in the moment right now cannot understand it.
What a perfect way to end for the day.
And there we are. Okay, so I will now say, as I always say, first off, we segue at this point in time to the after party. For those of you who have not been here before, if you have beamed in through the internet, all you need to do is stay right here, and poof, we will become the after party, during which we no longer record and we have a more informal conversation. Please stay because it's always fun. If you are on Facebook, to get into the after party, you need to leave Facebook and join the NCHE website page, which is ncheteach.org/conversations. If you are not going to stay and Carolee's back, poof. If you are not going to stick around for the after party, as always, I thank you for being here as part of the History Matters community, for being part of this discourse that really matters, no matter what we're talking about. It's a community of people talking about things of immediate political significance as well as historical significance, and that matters a lot. So I hope I will see you all again next week. And at this point, I should just say, yeah, it won't be till Thursday that I figure out what I'm going to say. Although Matt already threw an idea in my direction, which I might take that, in which case you'll be shocked. You'll be shocked if it comes before Thursday. At any rate, thank you guys all for being here. And for those of you who aren't sticking around, I hope I see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Newbie's been, I don't know if everyone could hear Newbie. He's been
peeping away,
chortling away for the entire episode.